Thanks. So we've got quite a difference of opinion on the panel then. We've got a 0.2 to 0.4 up to 4%, 10 times larger. Professor Blake.
Thank you, Chair. We're talking about gains from trade for whom? The only purpose of trade, the primary purpose of trade, is to make consumers better off. We're in the European Union where consumers are paying 20% more for their food, agriculture, and manufacturing and various other things than they need to be. So that is not a gain from trade if they're paying 20% more than they need to if they were outside the European Union. So we have to go back to saying, to whom are the gains? The gains must go to consumers, and they're not going to consumers while we're in the European Union. What
is your view on the picture with regard to GDP?
Well, that depends on which model you use, and the models that have been used to give us these results is the gravity model. And the gravity model says that trade depends on your neighbour. If your neighbour is larger and closest to you, you will do more trade. But that model does not work, does not hold up to the data. Take, for example, the UK's experience of being in the single market. Our trade has increased with the EU by 1% a year over 25 years. It's increased by 3% per year with the 111 countries that we trade with on WTO terms outside the customs union. So we are gaining from trade with those 111 countries outside the EU. And why should consumers not benefit from that? Why should they pay 20% more than they need to by being in this customs union? That's the question we should be asking.
So are you saying by that if we leave the European Union, we're outside a customs union and a free trade, rather than seeing a 1% growth, we'd see a 3% growth?
Well, we're already seeing a 3% growth.
No, but with the European Union, are you saying it's going to grow 3 times faster when we get out of the European Union and the barriers are higher?
Well, we are not going to place barriers. The whole point about gaining from leaving the European Union is should not be imposing barriers on trade with the EU.
With any country. Because if you do it for the EU, most favoured nation, you're going to have to do it for everyone.
Well, I understand that.
What are the knock-ons for agriculture?
That's the key point. That one could take on board what Professor Smith has said, but the whole point about the change in regime here is we have no intention of putting barriers on our trade with the EU. What we do have an intention of is taking off barriers from our trade with the rest of the world, which the EU has placed in its way. And that's 60% of our trade, roughly speaking. So it is important to see this as an incremental process. We're not putting barriers between ourselves and the EU, as Professor Blake has said. We're trying to keep those barriers down and get rid of the barriers with the rest of the world. And that's where the gains come.
Barriers to trade do not benefit consumers. We have 13,000 tariffs on consumers in the European Union. Not one of those tariffs benefits consumers. Not one of them. They benefit producers.
Well, what is the effect on producers then? What's going to be the effect on agriculture and manufacturing? And do you care?
Well, they're going to have to become more efficient. And in service. Let's give you an example.
If they don't become more efficient and go to business, is that okay?
Sorry?
If they don't become more efficient, as you see, if you're claiming they're currently inefficient, they might say they're fully efficient, they're at a latitude issue with maybe connecting with or competing with New Zealand. If they can't compete, do you think it's fair enough that the agriculture ceases in the UK and it's outsourced?
Well, agriculture won't cease. We used to have a subsidy system that worked very well when we joined the common
do you want a subsidy system?
Well, there are cases where you need to subsidise the practices of farmers doing public service duties in agriculture. And we used to have a reasonable subsidy system that wasn't waste of resources. The common agricultural system, the common agricultural policy leads to butter mountains and wine lakes, and is now leading to dumping of tomatoes in Ghana.
So that is not a free market approach to agriculture then when you're wanting subsidies?
I believe that if farmers are doing public good in terms of the environment, then I have no problem with subsidising them.
Thank you.